All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a highly polarized, right-wing piece of media that aggressively critiques the relationship between race, political allegiance, and modern democratic strategies. Now, just to be clear right up front, our goal with this explainer isn't to take a side. Instead, we're going to impartially deconstruct the exact arguments, the specific anecdotes, and the data points the source actually uses to build its case. By looking directly at the material, we're going to understand the architecture of this specific type of partisan rhetoric and really see how it's designed to persuade its audience. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the core argument. Second, the political case studies. Third, the redistricting debate. Fourth, we'll break it down by the numbers. And finally, we'll look at the cultural commentary.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the core argument, voting blocks versus captives.
The absolute heartbeat of the source's thesis really boils down to this central claim. I want black people to understand you're not a voting bloc, you're captives, and they call you out when they need you. The speaker essentially asserts that Democratic leaders prioritize raw political power over genuine representation. The underlying idea they're pushing here is that voters are basically treated like assets, right? Like they're kept locked away, only brought out for photo ops and door-knocking campaigns when election season rolls around, and then promptly put right back once the votes are tallied. Think about how that frames the relationship between voter and politician, not as a partnership at all, but literally as an ownership dynamic. So what does political allegiance actually look like in this context? Well, the source claims the political left relies heavily on a script of racism and white supremacy, and that they only pull those narratives out when their own power is threatened. They frame this as a deeply entrenched, long-standing strategy. In fact, they even go so far as to assert that President Lyndon B. Johnson designed a plan specifically to lock in party loyalty for 200 years. The video contends that instead of earning votes through competitive policies or, tangible socioeconomic improvements, this strategy demands blind allegiance based entirely on fear. Moving on to Section 2, Political Case Studies, Representation versus Loyalty. To move this from just theory into reality, the source points to a couple of specific electoral races to prove their point, arguing that party loyalty absolutely always supersedes actual demographic representation. Take Memphis District 9, for example. The source highlights that Democrats spent 20 years defending Steve Cohen, a 76-year-old white Democrat, against Charlotte Bergman, who is a black female Republican that ran for the seat 6 times. The speaker notes the sheer irony of the left claiming it's racist to replace a white man with a black woman in that specific context. And then, contrast that with the Virginia governor's race. There, Barack Obama flew down to Norfolk to rally 7,000 people for Abigail Spanberger, a white Democrat, going up against Winsome Earl Sears, a black female Republican veteran. For the speaker, these specific matchups are definitive, ironclad proof that the left doesn't actually care about black representation. They only care that you vote Democrat.
Next up, Section 3. The redistricting debate.
Okay, so the battleground now shifts down to the American South. Here's the sequence of events as laid out by the source. First, the Supreme Court struck down a majority black U.S. House district in Louisiana, ruling it unconstitutional. Following that, Alabama pursued its own new maps, ultimately moving to eliminate one of its 2 largely black congressional districts right before the midterms. Now, the political left's response to this was immediate. They launched emergency lawsuits, staged protests, and broadcasted claims of Jim Crow and white supremacy. But the video we're analyzing interprets these complex legal maneuvers in a completely different way. Rather than seeing this as a massive loss of voting power, the speaker completely reframes it. They argue that despite these shifting lines on a map, literally no one is losing their voice. Every single eligible voter can still cast a ballot. The core belief they're expressing here is that true political identity simply comes from being an American citizen with one vote. By that logic, the source insists that politicians should be forced to speak to broad, all-American interests, rather than, as they put it, pandering to isolated racial constituencies. It really highlights a fundamental disagreement over what actually makes representation fair. All right, let's jump into Section 4. By the numbers, examining the districts. The source poses a pretty pointed question here. If these contested districts are so crucial, why are they suffering so much under their current leadership? When you look at child poverty, the national average sits right around 15%, but in District 1 around Mobile, that number spikes to 24%. And over in District 7 around Birmingham, it climbs to 25% or even higher. This stark contrast is used by the speaker to argue that decades of guaranteed Democratic votes have actually resulted in horrific conditions for the very constituents living there. They're essentially asking the viewer to weigh political promises against real-world socioeconomic outcomes.
And then they hit us with this pretty devastating multiplier. 3 times. According to the source material, crime in the Birmingham urban area is 3 times the national average. Meanwhile, down in Mobile, it's double the national average. These statistics are leveraged to paint a really grim picture of failed leadership and perpetual victimhood. It directly challenges the viewer to consider whether political loyalty has actually delivered any safety or prosperity to these areas.
Beyond just the crime and child poverty stats, the source points to a highly concentrated share of Alabama's 4,600 homeless individuals residing specifically in these areas. Educational systems there are also portrayed as actively failing, making college admission incredibly difficult for local kids. And overall poverty in District 7 sits somewhere between 19 and 21%, which is far above the 12% national average. The speaker uses all of this data to challenge liberal leaders directly. They ask, what are you going to do to fix these things besides just say it's Trump's fault? It's a calculated, rhetorical strike meant to force accountability over pure rhetoric.
Which brings us to our final section, the cultural commentary, protests, and Jim Crow 2.0.
Here, the source takes a major pivot into cultural commentary, specifically targeting liberal protests. They highlight viral incidences of women throwing themselves to the ground in political despair, and the speaker provocatively labels this exact behavior as mental illness that's being encouraged by white liberal society. They claim this environment actively pushes Black women to act entirely outside of their own best interests. Now, interestingly, the video points out that Black men seem to be actively retreating from these demonstrations. The claim is that they're running away out of good sense and self-respect, refusing to participate in what the source views as purely performative and destructive theatrics.
All of this builds to a pretty striking, highly provocative concluding metaphor, Jim Crow 2.0. The speaker argues that unlike historical Jim Crow, which used obvious physical barriers to restrict where people could eat or sit, this new iteration is highly sophisticated. The chains, they argue, are mental rather than physical. It supposedly works by convincing voters that the very politicians harming their neighborhoods are actually their saviors. The ultimate tragic result of this, according to the source, is communities routinely voting to support their own demise.
So where does that leave us? It brings up a really vital question for us to chew on. Does this highly polarized rhetoric effectively expose political blind spots that desperately need addressing, or does it just create new, deeper dividing lines in the American electorate? Analyzing media exactly like this, breaking down the raw arguments, the data they choose to use, and those powerful metaphors is exactly how we become sharper, more informed consumers of information. I hope this explainer provided a clear, structured look into this specific perspective. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you next time.